Jake Turner was the epitome of a man who believed money could bend the world to his will. At just 38 years old, he had amassed a fortune that most could only dream of, an empire of businesses that stretched across industries, each success adding another layer to his towering confidence. Dressed in a tailored suit that likely cost more than a year's rent for the average person, he strutted through life with the air of someone untouchable, his designer shoes clicking on the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as if he owned the place. His Rolex gleaming under the London sun wasn't just a watch. It was a statement, a loud declaration of his wealth and status. To Jake, everything had a price tag, and there was nothing his billions couldn't buy or control. People were pawns, traditions were relics, and obstacles were merely inconveniences to be swept aside with a wave of his hand or a well-placed phone call. As he pushed through the crowd of tourists, snapping photos of the royal guards, he didn't see soldiers or symbols of duty. He saw men in costumes, irrelevant to his fast-paced world of power and profit. "Some of us have real business to do," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain, as if his self-proclaimed importance elevated him above everyone else. It was a lie, of course. There was no urgent meeting, no critical deal, just an inflated ego that thrived on the illusion of dominance. Jake's arrogance wasn't just palpable. It was his armor, forged from years of getting his way, a shield he thought impenetrable. But that day, in the shadow of an ancient palace, his wealth would meet something it couldn't buy. A lesson in humility delivered by the very people he dismissed as beneath him. Jake Turner's disdain for tradition was as bold as the wealth he flaunted. As he navigated the bustling courtyard of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by tourists marveling at the iconic royal guards in their red tunics and towering bearskin hats, he saw nothing worthy of admiration. To him, these men standing motionless in their ceremonial uniforms were mere relics. Men in costumes, clinging to an outdated pageantry that had no place in his modern billion-dollar world. The Guard's solemn march, a ritual steeped in centuries of history and sacrifice, was a joke to Jake, a waste of time that paled in comparison to the deals he claimed to orchestrate before breakfast. "In this day and age, we measure success in billions, not in brass buttons," he muttered loudly, his voice cutting through the crowd as he brushed past a family trying to capture the moment on camera. His words weren't just a casual observation. They were a declaration of superiority, a scoff at the very idea that anything beyond money held value. Tradition to Jake was a tourist trap, a quaint show for the masses, irrelevant to the fast-paced empire he'd built. He didn't see the discipline in the guards' unwavering stance or the honor in their duty. He saw only an annoyance, an obstacle in his path to whatever self-important destination he'd invented for the day. When an elderly veteran, his blazer adorned with medals earned through real battles, dared to correct him, "These men are active duty soldiers, not actors." Jake didn't pause to reflect. Instead, he sneered, flicking his hand dismissively, his Rolex catching the sunlight as if to underscore his point. "Blood and sacrifice? For what, playing soldier in funny hats?" he retorted, his tone mocking and loud enough to draw stares. To Jake, the guard's presence was a performance, not a pillar of national pride, and he couldn't fathom why anyone would waste energy on such archaic customs. His disrespect wasn't just ignorance, it was willful, a product of a man so consumed by his own wealth that he couldn't see the strength in what stood before him, a strength that would soon knock him off his pedestal. Jake Turner's world of wealth and self-assured dominance faced its first crack when reality stepped forward in the form of an elderly veteran at Buckingham Palace. As Jake strutted through the courtyard, his expensive suit pristine and his Rolex flashing like a beacon of his success, he had been loudly mocking the royal guards, calling them toy soldiers and their duty a pointless show. For tourists, his arrogance was unshakable, his belief that money trumped all else absolute. But then came a voice, rough with age and experience, cutting through his bluster. The veteran, his blazer pinned with campaign medals that gleamed faintly in the sunlight, stood nearby, watching Jake's tirade with a soldier's quiet resolve. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone sharp yet respectful. "These men are active duty soldiers, not just actors in a play. They've earned their place through blood and sacrifice. For most, those words might have prompted a pause, a moment of reflection on the weight of such a statement. Not Jake. He didn't slow his stride or soften his sneer. With a glance over his shoulder, eyes narrowed and lips curled into a smirk, he dismissed the veteran as if the man were spouting nonsense. Blood and sacrifice? For what? Playing soldier in funny hats? He scoffed, his hand flicking upward in a gesture of contempt, the sunlight catching his watch as if to punctuate his disdain. Turning to the growing crowd, he raised his voice, ensuring all could hear. In this day and age, people like us measure success in billions. These guys, they're just here for the tourists. It's all a show. The veteran stiffened, his posture still carrying the dignity of battles fought. But Jake didn't care. He saw no value in the old man's words, no merit in the guard service. To him, the veteran was just another irrelevant figure, like the guards themselves. Obstacles to his narrative of supremacy. His refusal to listen wasn't just arrogance. It was a deliberate rejection of a reality he couldn't buy or control. But that reality, embodied by the guards and the veteran's quiet warning, was closing in, ready to teach Jake a lesson his billions couldn't deflect. Jake Turner's arrogance reached its peak when he decided to test the Royal Guard's resolve, stepping into their path with a smirk that dared them to challenge his self-proclaimed authority. The scene at Buckingham Palace had already been tense. His loud mockery of the guards as toy soldiers and men in costumes had drawn stares from tourists and a sharp rebuke from a veteran. But Jake wasn't done. As the drums echoed in the distance, signaling the changing of the guard, he planted himself squarely in the courtyard, adjusting his tie with exaggerated precision. "Let them come," he taunted, his voice dripping with bravado. "I'd like to see these toy soldiers try to move me. Do they know who I am?" To him, the approaching formation was a joke, a quaint tradition he could bend like everything else in his billion-dollar world. But the guards, led by Sergeant Ryan Williams, were no ordinary men. Their boots struck the cobblestones in perfect synchrony, a rhythmic thunder that drowned out Jake's bluster. Standing tall, their red tunics crisp and bearskin hats unmoving, they embodied a duty forged through centuries of discipline and honor. As they drew closer, Williams locked eyes with Jake for a fleeting moment. No fear, no hesitation, just the steely focus of a soldier on a mission. Jake stood his ground, smug and unshaken, expecting them to swerve or stop. They didn't. The first guard's shoulder met Jake's chest with a swift, deliberate force, not violent, but precise enough to lift him off his feet and send him stumbling backward onto the stones. The crowd gasped, but the guards didn't flinch. Their formation held, steps unwavering, eyes fixed ahead, as if Jake were nothing more than a gust of wind to be passed through. Sergeant Williams led them onward, his command absolute, their purpose unyielding. They didn't care about Jake's wealth, his Rolex, or his threats. They weren't there to negotiate with his ego. This was their duty, a tradition and responsibility they upheld with an unbreakable resolve that no amount of money could sway. In that moment, Jake's illusion of control met an unstoppable force, and the guards marched on, leaving him sprawled and humbled in their wake. Jake Turner's world crumbled the moment the Royal Guard's shoulder sent him tumbling onto the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace. Just seconds before, he'd stood defiant, a billionaire cloaked in arrogance, certain that his wealth and status made him untouchable. But as he hit the ground, the breath knocked from his chest, the illusion of invincibility he'd built over years of boardroom victories shattered. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his dominance, was now streaked with dust, the fabric crumpled and wrinkled beyond repair. His Rolex, still gleaming on his wrist, seemed laughably irrelevant as he scrambled to his feet, hands trembling while he fumbled to adjust a tie that hung limp and disheveled. The pain in his body was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the searing blow to his ego. "Do you know who I am?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and disbelief, echoing off the ancient stone walls. The crowd watched, some shocked, some amused, but the guards marched on, their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm, ignoring him as if he'd never existed. Jake's threats, his insults, his frantic assertions of power meant nothing now. He wasn't in his world of high-stakes deals and booing subordinates anymore. He was just a man, sprawled and humiliated by the very force he'd mocked. when a security officer approached, calm and professional, informing him, "Sir, you were warned multiple times to clear the path." Jake barely heard it. His mind raced, grasping for a way to reclaim control, threatening lawsuits, arrests, anything to salvage his pride. But then the police arrived, a female officer stepping forward with a firm, "You're being detained for interfering with military personnel." His face flushed, his shouts grew desperate. "I'll have your jobs for this." But the law didn't bend. Escorted off the grounds, Jake faced a stark truth. His billions couldn't erase this moment. The guards had stripped him of his power, leaving him exposed as a man humbled not by force, but by the quiet, unyielding strength of duty he'd underestimated. In that courtyard, he was powerless, and the weight of that reality crushed him more than the fall ever could. Jake Turner's encounter with the royal guards at Buckingham Palace was more than a public tumble. It was a profound lesson etched into the cobblestones where his arrogance met its match. Moments before, he'd been a billionaire titan, striding through the courtyard with a Rolex on his wrist and a sneer on his lips, convinced that his wealth could command anything. Even the centuries-old traditions he dismissed as tourist traps. But when the guards, led by Sergeant Ryan Williams, marched forward and knocked him flat with a single, deliberate shoulder, Jake's world flipped upside down. Sprawled on the ground, his suit dirtied and his pride in tatters, he raged, "Do you know who I am?" But the guards didn't pause, their boots striking the stones in unison as they left him behind. The crowd's stares, the security officer's stern warning, and the police's calm detention only deepened his humiliation. This wasn't his boardroom, where money dictated outcomes. This was a place where duty and honor held sway, and his billions were powerless against them. As he was escorted off the palace grounds, still shouting threats of lawsuits and retribution, the harsh truth settled in. Some things cannot be bought. The royal guards, with their unwavering discipline and silent strength, stood as living proof that tradition and sacrifice carry a weight no fortune can shift. Jake had mocked their brass buttons and funny hats, but in the end, it was he who looked foolish, a man who'd mistaken wealth for worth. For someone who'd spent his life measuring success in dollars, this was a bitter pill. His status, his influence, all rendered meaningless in the face of a force that didn't bend for anyone. The lesson was clear. Respect, duty, and the quiet power of those who uphold them outlast fleeting riches. Standing there, staring at the guards' retreating backs, Jake learned the hard way that his money couldn't buy everything, least of all the dignity he'd lost that day. It's a reminder for us all. In a world obsessed with wealth, there are still pillars of value that stand firm, untouched by the highest bidder. And sometimes, they're the ones that knock us down to size. Jake Turner's story at Buckingham Palace reveals timeless lessons that hit home as we grow older. Wealth and status don't guarantee respect or control, and some things like duty, honor, and tradition stand stronger than money ever will. For us seniors, who've watched the world change over decades, it's a reminder of what endures. Jake thought his billions could bulldoze anything, but the royal guard's unyielding march knocked him down, literally and figuratively, proving that true power often lies in quiet resolve, not loud boasts. We've seen this in our own lives, the neighbor who quietly served in the military, the parent who worked tirelessly without fanfare, or the community traditions that outlast fleeting trends. The lesson? Don't let pride or possessions define you. Respect what's earned through sacrifice, not bought with cash. At our age, we know life's richest rewards, love, integrity, legacy, can't be purchased. So next time you're tempted to judge someone's worth by their wallet, think of Jake, humbled on those cobblestones. Honor the steady hands that hold our world together. They're the ones that teach us what really matters, long after the glitter of wealth fades.